Thanks, everybody. So glad you tuned into this episode of Navigate. I'm Tim Austin, owner and coach at EncompassLifeCoaching.com, and I'm also the host of this show. What do we need to consider when processing and planning a major transition? There are often so many areas that need our attention. It can definitely feel overwhelming. And like me, I'm sure you've wondered at times, am I considering the right things as I walk through this season of change? Is there something I'm missing here? Transition is multifaceted. There may be more to this transition than what you've considered so far. And as our guest will share with us today, there's a process that can help guide us through all of these decisions that we need to make. Whether you're planning a move across town or to a new country, you'll want to listen into this conversation. Jeff Simons is a missiologist at CORE with an MA in Intercultural Studies. He works out this passion and calling as a trained leadership coach and a cross-cultural companion to global leaders in major transition. And Jeff does this in partnership with his wife, Sara, the founder of The Way Between, an organization serving global leaders in major transition. They are a family on mission with their 2 kids, now residing in Denver, Colorado, after 12 years of overseas work in 3 countries. Jeff also hammers out his passion through the artistic spiritual disciplines of upcycled woodworking, clay sculpture, and literary wordsmithing. He's a contemplative, naturalist, egalitarian, and postmodern strategist for kingdom influence. So join me as I have a conversation with Jeff about a structure for processing and planning transitions called missions mapping. All right. Hey, Jeff, welcome to Navigate Podcast. I am super excited about this conversation we're going to be having today.
Yes, thank you. Very excited to talk with you. Been following you for a few years and very excited to have a good conversation with you.
And I've been following you guys for a couple years as well. Our listeners that have been tracking with us, you may recall a couple episodes I did with Jeff's wife, Sara, and we had some great conversations around transition, and you were still in Spain at that time.
That's right.
Yeah. And so now you're somewhere else. So you've been in 3 countries throughout the span of 12 years, as I understand it, and now just recently returning to have returned to the U.S. So tell me about this transition. What prompted it? How's it going?
Yeah. So we are kind of, I part of us feels like we're still in the air. On the way to the U.S.
How long? When did you come back?
We landed 2 months ago.
Okay.
In the middle of COVID, flights got canceled 3 times. Finally made it. Quarantined with family in Michigan. Got a car. Made our way across the Midwest, seeing a few family members, and now we are in the Denver area, in temporary housing and figuring out life a piece at a time. And so we are in the midst of doing the process that we're going to talk about today. And this is a process that we've developed more and more as we've gone through major transitions. So Sara was in England and different parts of Europe for a concentrated 3 years. I was in Korea and different parts of Asia for over 3 years. And then together, and that was before we were married, and together we've been in Spain the last 8 years. And so now we are setting up life in Denver and strategically doing ministry from this base. So,
okay. All right.
Yeah.
Good. Well, tell me how is the transition been going so far? I know, like you said, it's been you kind of still in limbo in some ways, temporary housing and getting your feet on the ground there. But what does it look like as far as expectations? How has it met your expectations or not?
Yeah. It's been quite the process. We've got 2 little ones, 11-year-old and a 7-year-old. She was born there, and he was only 3, Amalia and Matai. And, so for them, this is a move to a foreign country. Like, they know some friends and family back here that we've been on furlough, that kind of thing. But really all their memories or all their life has been in Spain. And so they are getting used to a new country. Spain had crossed the threshold a few years back to being more home for us than anything. But we have an element of coming back, and they don't. So we're trying to give space and just, we have some fun lists that we're doing that kind of go along with this mission mapping of what kind of things do we notice that are different here compared to southern Spain. What are some things that we want to take with us and continue to incorporate and into our family rhythms that we learned in Spain, that might be awkward here. Our little guy, who's usually very extroverted, we find him to be a little bit shy and slow to approach other kids, because he's kind of observing, like, how do kids interact here, and
right.
So, and we're just doing a lot of logistical things, from finding a car to updating our tech and our phones and getting on a phone plan here, and several of those pieces, house searching, all of those.
Sure.
And with the weird overlay of COVID, everything's just a little strange and off and not quite normal. Going to the grocery store and trying to visit a church and all of those things. So we have that strange overlay at the same time.
Yeah. Well, this is what we're gonna talk about. We're gonna talk about missions mapping, and as when you use the term missions mapping, what comes to mind is something very, for me, as I just hear the term, what comes to mind is something very strategic and more of for the educated and for the adults. But here, even just now, I heard you say you're bringing your kids into this process too. So this is going to be a fun conversation to hear more about what missions mapping is. So why don't we just start with that? Tell us about missions mapping. What is it? How did you get involved with it?
Yeah. So my background, coming out of Christian education with a psych emphasis, and then later having a master's degree in intercultural studies at Fuller. This really comes out of some of the anthropological research. Particularly this idea is developed out of Dr. R. Daniel Shaw. He's the leading anthropologist and missiologist at Fuller. And he has a book called Transculturation that really is like, in one way simple and in other ways incredibly profound. But remember being back and as a missiologist at heart myself, taking some of those principles and saying, how does that inform how we go into a new place, from when I moved to Korea to when I moved to Spain to even going for a 1-week short-term mission trip somewhere. These principles can be applied. And really, I mean, the best way to equate it is, over the years we've learned to move from a literal Bible translation. When we do translation into other languages, we realized, okay, doing a literal translation actually doesn't equate. It doesn't always bring the message or the significance across. And we've learned over the years through Bible translation that we need to do a deeper process that takes the culture into account. And we actually do something called dynamic equivalence, where we say, okay, this is the passage, this is what it's saying, this was what it meant back in the New Testament culture. But if we look at this culture, how would we explain it in terms, both in the wording and in things that make sense in the environment of this other culture, And so it kind of takes that same aspect, that same idea, and it says, when we're landing and setting up life as missionaries in another culture, how can we do some transculturation? How can we, in a sense, remove some of our own American culture, be good participant observers, create connections with key people in order to actually enter the culture well as guests in a cultural sensitive way. And so what we do as a family, what we've been doing as a family is literally the first thing I did when we got to Denver is I went to the grocery store or the gasoline station, and I got a physical paper map of the greater Denver area. Mm-hmm. And we started working through these lenses that we've developed. And this is all kind of based off of some of that transculturation idea from Dr. Shaw, and have developed kind of 7 key lenses. And we take one at a time, and we start actually physically mapping them out with markers on a piece of paper to start to see what that informs us about this new city.
Okay.
And how it works, and where we might fit, and what is God doing, and what does God have for us in this place. That's a bit of a background to it.
Yeah, no, I love that. So, and as you know, we talk a lot about transition. It's a theme in this podcast around transition, how to navigate transitions. And so to me, this seems like a strategic way to approach transition. Transition is multifaceted. There's a lot of different things and that we need to be looking at, approaching it from different angles. And I'm assuming, since you are not now going to the field, but you've returned from the field, this also works for returnees from the field. So maybe tell me a little bit about that as we go into talking about some of these lenses that you look through.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is applicable to any new place that you're going into, or even saying, okay, I'm not moving any place, but how could I actually take these lenses and look at my neighborhood and my home church and all that in a whole new light, in a global Christian, a global mission perspective. Global mission is kind of a catchphrase that I think is pretty powerful, where it's how do we think globally, but also think locally about the kingdom of God and what God's doing, even in our neighborhood. These lenses can be helpful for even looking at that, but particularly for transition, employing this kind of perspective in that first year or two on landing, thinking about it before launch, going into landing into a new city, whether that's, God's moving you to another part of the U.S. and you're a U.S. citizen, missionary, or if you're moving overseas, these lenses can be helpful. And that first 1 or 2 years is so critical. It's different than the other years that you spend there. And those who have been on the field, and yourself even, you could probably affirm this, that there are specific, habits where you set up life, how you start engaging with locals, engaging in language learning, these kind of things that are so critical in those first 1 or 2 years, that if they're not done well, or major mistakes, or just in naivety, it's really hard to go back and kind of correct some of that, or move to another place, or change your routes, but thinking about this ahead of time can really help you strategically enter in a way that helps you engage in ministry more effectively, but also set yourself, your family, your life up for sustainable long-term, however long the Lord would have you there, be sustainable over time. In a way that's healthy for you too. So,
So what we're going to talk about now is you're going to give us just a taste of a few of these lenses that you look through, and I think you said there's 7 lenses, so we won't have time to talk about them all today, but we're going to talk about a couple of them. The first one we're going to talk about is spiritual landscape. So why don't you unpack that a little bit for us?
Okay. Tim, I may just read off, in a sense, the titles of the 7.
Oh, yeah.
If that's great. Okay, just to kind of wet people's whistle too, like to see kind of what, those pieces are. We won't go into, like you said, we won't go into all 7 today, but we'll dive into that spiritual landscape one first. So they're not in any particular order, but I do put the spiritual landscape one first on the list, because I do think that that's pretty key, especially as mission-minded folk going into a new area. The second one is history of place. So really kind of being a researcher and a student of the place and the people. The third is bicultural bridges. And these are key connecting people that can help you bridge the gap that you can't do because of either lack of time or experience in that culture. They become informants, key informants. The fourth one is diversity and dispersion. So really getting to know the overlay of the social classes, the economic environment, justice issues, this sort of thing. The fifth one that we'll hopefully have some time today to look at is family values and sustainability. The sixth one is global mission. And so that's kind of that double-lensed missional view that we talked about earlier. And then lastly is living space and transport. So real tangible, like where you actually set up life and how you actually get around can really affect the way that you connect or disconnect, as it were.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so this really does encompass so many areas. Like you said, the very, looking at the spiritual landscape, which you started with, but then, we're talking about very tangible, practical, day to day, how we structure our lives and so it seems pretty all encompassing. So let's dive into this spiritual landscape. Tell us, why don't you unpack that a little bit for us?
Great. Yeah. And Tim, just knowing, you're having experience overseas too, would love to hear, if anything sparks, either questions or stories from your experience. I know that would be really valuable to the discussion here too. So, so let me just give a preview of what this spiritual landscape one is. So this is actually kind of looking with spiritual eyes at the actual landscape and the place in which God has planted you. So a lot of ways that there's several ways to do this, but one way that Sara and I do this is through prayer walking. Picking different regions, different areas, walking around and just putting spiritual lenses on. And we practice three-way listening. We also do prayer driving. We're back in the US. It's very car dependent. But we do prayer driving as well in the same way. And we take a three-way listening posture. So listening to what is God saying? God is already here. What is he doing? And observing that. Listening to others, either, vicariously as we're walking along or others like bicultural bridges, people, and listening to our own heart, our own self. What, a lot of times the Spirit is speaking to us through those gut reactions, through senses of peace, or speaking directly, through words of clarity or prophetic words. Really, really important. And this is very key to the way between, the way that we do things in the way between. Sara and I have been in the member care game for about 12 years now, served with a dynamic team in Spain, and in this have developed what we call a holistic approach to engaging in transition. And so you can really do this in this spiritual landscape one. And so getting out and walking, doing new prayer postures, even trying out new spiritual disciplines can be really powerful during this transition time, bring fresh wind, and actually help us encounter God in new ways. And sometimes just being in a new place, you actually encounter new things about God that you didn't know before. And sometimes that comes through experiencing God in a new place. Sometimes that comes through opening yourself up to new prayer postures, new prayer disciplines, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So the other two, and I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
Just thinking about when we went to Central Asia back in the 90s, and this was our first assignment, and there being so little, or at least that we knew of, little information out there for us to get a handle on what is that going to look like spiritually? What are we walking into? And so I felt very unprepared, for what I was going to experience in terms of some of the spiritual opposition and warfare and atmosphere that often we experienced as a heaviness, as an oppression, as various ways that we felt this. And we began to, once we landed there and had some time, begin to understand around that. But we really didn't this just intrigues me because there's probably, especially nowadays with all of the information available to us through technology, as we tune ourselves to the Lord and what He's saying, whether we do the prayer walking or prayer driving, or that we can get ahead of the game maybe a little bit. I don't think there's any substitute for actually being there on the ground, and having some of, the experience and the understanding through experience and conversations around that. But it certainly seems to me like this is a key area that I think we often maybe miss in our. We were just excited to go to the field, and not really, and I think the Lord really protected us from a lot of things that we were unaware of, obviously. And that's part of doing mission as well. Yeah.
I'm reminded of Dr. Charles Kraft. One of his main things, he was coming from a discipline of anthropology, but one of his main observances around the world is, large majority, 80-90% of the cultures on the globe operate in a daily way, like their whole, even the way that their daily routines, the way that their schedule is, are really based around spirituality and interaction with the spiritual world. Now, I mean, this was very blatant to me when I landed in Nepal and we were walking around. There were little shrines and little areas everywhere where offerings could be made to the spirits. There's, and people were, constantly, as they would pass, they would stop and do something there, and I started to realize, like, these are very spiritually minded people, very, integrated into their daily routine, maybe more than, my life was as a Christian back in the U.S., or other people I knew. Like, wow, okay, these people are serious. Whether or not they knew Christ was more the question, but we come, at least as U.S. missionaries, and this is kind of Dr. Kraft's main point, is that we know our Bibles well. We learn it. We learn evangelism and techniques. We even learn how to debate the scripture and apologetics and this kind of thing. But actually being able to maturely deal in the spiritual realm is something that is a real growth edge. It certainly has been for me. I feel like this last decade or more of my life has been learning actually, how to actually really interact with the Holy Spirit, that part of the triune God that we serve. And this is an area where it gives you that practice from the get-go, right? When you get on the ground, how do I start to mature in this, be connected with the Spirit, listening to God, and observing, what are the realities of God's presence in this place, whether it's in the U.S. or abroad.
Right. Good.
So.
And I kind of, so I picture you and Sara having this physical map laid out on your table, okay, that you got, that you picked up at the gas station. And what goes on that map in terms of the spiritual landscape? What do you put down there?
That's a great question. That's a great question. This is arguably, of the 7 lenses, one of the harder to necessarily, draw something concerted on the map. Okay. But one of the things is that we have started to look at is areas where we've been led so far to connect with certain spiritual leaders in the area, faith communities. And as we talk and interview pastors in the area, other spiritual leaders, we're discerning, even some of the history pieces that come then into this. All of these lenses have some overlap. Where have there been major atrocities or a sense of real strongholds in the city? Spiritually, here in Denver, one of the things we're learning is just a long history and overlay of gun violence and mass shootings. And so, and this is not a commentary at all on where you stand with, right to own guns or anything like that, but there's just been some really tragic things. Columbine.
Sure.
We recently just met a wonderful Christian couple, and in getting to know them, found out that their daughter was one of the students who was shot and miraculously survived, and actually grew in the Lord in a powerful way through that experience. It has a powerful speaking testimony, and has a ministry and books that she's put out, so you see God moving through it. But it's, the question of what is going on the spiritual level to have such a concentration in a small area, in the school environments, this kind of thing. So conversations like that with spiritual leaders, with other Christians in there, you start to get a sense of, some of the areas, either that the church is active, and that can be mapped on there, okay, or areas where there seems to be a real heaviness and oppression, a darkness, it is easier to talk about when we talk about other countries, but it's harder to talk about, and like sort of own up to it and interact with it here, it seems, on the ground, in the U.S.
Yeah. Well, I could see where as you do some of that, have some of those conversations, and do some of that research, and keep your ears to the ground. I think I can see how that could be helpful, just having some themes that you write down on the map, some themes, and seeing the kind of the connections between different historical events, issues in the church, various things, and what themes come out of that, spirit, from a spiritual perspective, looking at the spiritual landscape.
One thing that I'm doing some research and just getting into the reading on it is the longer history in this area between Native American Indians and the settlers and the movement west, and some of the tensions there, and some of the bloody massacres that happened, right in this area on the land,
right?
Things like that, where you're like, okay, what has that affected in the spiritual realm? So there's some pieces like that. And these were things that were quite blatant, not coming from a charismatic or Pentecostal background myself. When I've been overseas, it seems like my spiritual senses are heightened. There's just a lot more blatant things going on that I then have to have the courage to then interact with, even in Spain. You think of Spain as a European country, but there was, quite a bit of regular. I was up in the night praying over the house, praying over my family, praying for people and against things, and just getting the hard learning curve track on that, living overseas, and saying, how do I, continue to have that awareness coming back and living in the U.S. So
Yeah. Good. Well, hey, let's look at another one of these lenses here. Family values and sustainability. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So this is one that really has become key from a member care perspective of just seeing the attrition of workers off the field. You see almost the same burnout and attrition rates as you do with U.S.-based ministry leaders, pastors, as you do with missionaries on the field. And what's sad is that a lot of some of those top reasons that have come out in the research and all that, don't have to do with necessarily direct ministry. They have to do with burnout because of bad balance of family life, bad balance of actually having, time for just friends and not, always being in direct ministry, or setting up that house church in your house, but not having any kind of safe, set apart space for family, and this kind of thing. So this consideration, I would just say, as a little bit on my own member care soapbox here, is so important and yet so easily neglected. And I think it is a symptom of one of the most difficult areas, I think, as Americans in our culture. It's a constant battle to find that balance with the value of family and what our family needs are, and then what we are called to, in work and vocation. So, this is a great place too, to like especially bring the whole family into the process, where, for younger kids, it might not be easy to go out and do prayer walking, and this kind of thing. But in this, discussion of, when you're looking at expectations, desires, what was life like for us back there? What do we desire and need for life here? Engaging the kids in conversation around friends, around school, around church environment, around, family values of what you like to do for fun and being able to access that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How you bond as a family and making sure to protect both the space, but also where you set up life, could be influenced not only by your ministry call, but also by of needs for the family, and dreaming together. We're in this new place. We've got a fresh start in a lot of ways. What do we all dream about, for our new life here? And then there's also the like physical and mental health considerations, for environment and maybe physical limitations people have in your family. So, some of the pieces, I don't know if there were if this jogs for you to mind anything for your own family, Tim.
Well, there's so much to be considered in this area. Like, and I don't recall doing much of this preparing to go to Central Asia 24 years ago. I think we did this better in later transitions, during furloughs and seasons where we could reflect on what, debrief, reflect what was hard, what was, and I think that's all, we place such high value on debriefing, a season of debriefing and processing your experience, when you're in a transition season. But I think we did more of that later on in different seasons of transition better than when we first went out. But I think, I recall, for example, Jeff, when we had our first 3 years on the field, kind of midway into our first 3 years in Central Asia, the NGO that we were part of, the humanitarian organization that we were part of, there was a kind of blew up in terms of some team conflict. And there was, I was on the leadership team at that point. But I was new, really. I mean, we'd only been in the country a year and a half. And I feel like what I was experiencing was way beyond, what I could really handle. And so with all the conflict and uncertainty, and me being a peacemaker kind of person, I'm trying to get, in between and wanting to resolve this conflict. And, and I came close to the edge of really, I just was really depleted. And I remember going home, one day, and talking to my wife and just saying, let's just pack our bags. I'm done with this, let's go home, and of course, her being the more stable one in the family we were able to have a good conversation and realize that wasn't the direction we were to be going. We were to hold on, hang in there. But it did come to a point where I had to look at this whole area of family values and sustainability. What's important now? How are we going to not just survive, but thrive long term? And that set us on a path, set me on a path of really looking into that. So I think sometimes these moments, these seasons of challenge and crisis, and they tend to bring us to that point of looking at it. But I'm hearing you say, let's get ahead of the game. Let's be proactive about this, which I love. And as we go into this next season, what's important to us as a family.
Yeah. There's been a kind of a study done on sustainability of family, and they have found, and this is usually when you're talking about immersion into another culture, but I have found this to be just as poignant, if not more so, with reentry back into your own home culture. Which a lot of us know can sometimes be harder than actually going to a very, very foreign culture and trying to set up life. Both are difficult, right? But sometimes you come back and you sort of expect everything to be the same and you're familiar with the culture, right? But then you realize things have changed, people have changed, you've changed, and finding your grounding again and your identity again can be very difficult. But one of the things is that, in a sense, if you think about it like a chain, now this isn't a weakest link analogy, this is a different chain analogy. And it says if you want to move that chain forward, the person who, for whatever reason, is struggling the most or has the most challenge with immersing or re-immersing, as it were, with reentry, sets the pace for the family. So if you think about when you're hiking with a group and you want to summit the mountain, one of those strategies for backpacking and hiking is to put the person with the slowest pace at the front, because that the people behind them help encourage them, keep them going, but also you stay together that way. And if you need to stay together, especially if it's more of a survival trip or this kind of thing, staying together is important. And so you let them set the pace. And they encourage that same analogy when you're immersing into another culture or coming back. This could be family or this could be team. The person, who needs that slower pace, you need to put them at the front and let them set the pace and move with them. Otherwise, you start putting a lot of tension on that chain, and you could have some breakages and things like that just become destructive for a team, for a family.
Right.
And so thinking about that as you're talking and looking at, how everyone's doing with the adjustment. So here's some examples of just, these are personal for us as far as lenses we're looking through in the family values and sustainability. This isn't necessarily, the biblical mandate for everybody when they go into a city, but for one of the reasons that we are back, we would like to be on the field, but one of the reasons that we've come back is this last year has been very difficult for both sets of parents. And we just felt like in part of our discernment process, the Lord was saying, it's time to go back and prioritize our parents and our family. And so that's one of the things that's brought us back. And we're looking at, we have some family in the area, and then we're looking at moving parents here. And we're saying, okay, where are the good retirement communities that has shown up on our mapping? What is the kind of radius that we don't want to be, too far away from them in order to be easy distance and help and support to our parents? So that's part of our mapping. We have a high value ourselves as a family for nature and being active. We love to hike and camp. We've got the Rockies right here, which is awesome and beautiful, and there's so much to explore. So we would like to be able to get quick access into nature if possible. So looking at, okay, how could we be maybe on the western side of Denver to be more easy access, or on a light rail or a way that we could get to nature more quickly. So that's one of the things we're considering when we're looking for a place to land. We also have a value for the city. We love the city flow. We love to be part of the urban environment. We love the ethnic diversity. Justice issues are big for us. And so, it might be that we live more urban, but we have quick access to nature, or vice versa. We maybe live on the outskirts, but we're near the light rail stations that can take us into the city easily to be a part of something that's going on there. We also have the piece of the fact that we are a member care ministry, the way between, and our core audience is global workers. Well, there are a ton of global workers that come through the Denver airport down to Colorado Springs, to a lot of the mission organizations there. How can we place ourselves easily and accessibly on that route between those two, where, a lot of what we do is over Zoom and phone and that kind of thing, but we would like to have a place where people could come and land and be coached or trained or do transition work with us here, so different pieces like that, simplicity, kids in the school and the school environment. What schools are we looking at? They've got unique needs going through the Spanish system. They're ahead in some areas. They're behind in some areas. They're needing some extra educational support right now. What schools are offering that? and also the need that we will need some sort of office space outside of our home office, as Sara and I both are working full time and with the kids and helping them with online school right now with COVID. So all of those pieces then can start to show up on this map. And as you integrate all these lenses, certain areas and certain places start becoming quite clear as to where to focus, to do life, to set up life, to vary your route, figure out your routes of travel, and this kind of thing. So,
yeah, good.
Yeah.
This is something that just came to mind when you're talking about family values and sustainability. I think we often get in, especially in the missions world, as global workers, there's times we just don't really feel like we're free to dream and express our desires around these things, because, it's, whatever terminology you want to use, but, God is calling us there. We don't really have a choice in this, in terms of, our living environment and things like that. This is, so there's not maybe a freedom or a sense of like, I'm free to really dream about this or strategize about this. Right. But I think it is important. And maybe it's a little easier to do when you start really having real situations come up, like aging parents and things like that force you to look at these things. But I think there's always areas that we can, no matter where we end up actually living, that we can do well to spend some time in this area and really talk about as a family, bring our kids into the discussion, like you're saying, what's important, each one. And I love your example of let the slower one kind of set the pace. That's a good analogy. Even as you think about, climbing the mountain or whatever. Letting the slower one set the pace. Boy, we would have done a lot of preventative, kind of damage control if you can think in those terms and process things that way and work through things that way. So, very good, Jeff. I appreciate, man, you sharing these things. And this was just 2 of the lenses we've highlighted today. There's actually 7, which you mentioned earlier. Right. Yeah. So we've already talked about having another conversation around this. So as we wrap up today's podcast, I just want to say to our listeners, be ready for another one. We'll highlight, we'll delve in deeper to this and talk about some of these other lenses. If you're in transition right now, this is, or you're going to be at some point, we all will be. So a great way to look at transition from another. This has brought some fresh perspective, even for me, Jeff, around how some different areas to look at in terms of transition. So I hope our listeners, I know our listeners will be encouraged and challenged by this. So, hey, thank you so much for joining me. And again, we'll plan to do this again. But let me ask you this, which sometimes I ask my guests on this podcast. Wrap up with this question. Thinking through those seasons of transition and where you've been, and what might you say to your younger self if you could, and give them some advice? What would that be?
That's a good question. Definitely. I think my younger self did not have quite as much confidence in my ability to hear and discern with the Lord. I did that mainly, sort of just in individual prayer time. But I think I've learned that there are so many different places in which God is speaking in discernment, and actually taking into consideration that larger umbrella from, inviting community to speak into that, hearing those voices, hearing what you're hearing from Scripture, learning to actually listen to the Holy Spirit and trust your heart and your gut that the Spirit's speaking through some of that. The Lord does really give us the desires of our heart. He places them in there, and sometimes those gut, senses or intuitions is the Spirit speaking. So just kind of, really listening through much more variety of means, and being patient and helping, put those pieces together as a puzzle towards discernment. I think that would be my encouragement to younger Jeff.
That's good. I like that. Yeah.
And not rushing it, waiting for those pieces to form a clearer puzzle before taking the next step.
Yeah. So, yeah. Well, that's great advice for all of us. And I think that these lenses by which we look at transition are just part of saying, God, there's so many different ways you can speak to us and lead us. Mm-hmm. And I think of that old Rich Mullins song where he says, everywhere I go, I see you. There's part of that song. I don't even know what song it is, but everywhere we go and everywhere we're at, we can see him from different approaches and angles and begin to discern his voice as we take in all these different aspects of whether that be conversations or prayer walks and some research, whatever we're doing. But I just think there's so many ways that we can hear God's voice and see him more clearly. So yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Good. Well, Jeff, thank you again. And look forward to another conversation here in the near future. Say hello to Sara and may God continue to bless you guys as you settle in and transition there in Colorado.
Yes. Thank you so much. Looking forward to talking again. And I'll send you new pictures of the map as it develops more and more.
Oh, good. Very cool. All right. Looking forward to that.
Okay. Thanks so much, Tim.
Thank you. Bye-bye. I hope my conversation with Jeff has whetted your appetite to learn more about the process of missions mapping through transitions. As Jeff told me, and I agree, this kind of intentionality could mean the difference of actually immersing and building relationships or living the frustration of always being the outsider. So get ready for more as I meet back up with Jeff for another episode real soon. And in the meantime, I encourage you to take a look at the resources Jeff and his wife Sara provide on their website, thewaybetween.org. And let me just encourage you, it's never too late to make some intentional decisions around your transition. And whether you need support working through an unexpected change or to plan and strategize something new, reach out to me at encompasslifecoaching.com and begin to navigate your transition with confidence and clarity. Thanks again for joining me for this episode of Navigate. I've been your host, Tim Austin, and I can't wait to see you next time. Bye-bye.